Hello and welcome. So glad you've joined us. My name's Victoria Kettis and I'm a mum. I'm also a manager and facilitator with Family Smart. So as parents, when our kids are having a hard time or we see something for the first time, we might question what's going on. We often wonder what are typical behaviors and how we know when something more might be going on for our child or youth. Our gut is telling us something's going on, but it's difficult to put our finger on it. So let's watch an animation to help us understand this and put some into context of the conversation we're going to have today.
Why can it feel so tricky to tell if our kids are on track, going through a phase, as opposed to struggling with something more or beyond the behaviors? It's so difficult to know if your child is presenting developmentally in range and when it's something more because thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are always found on a continuum and because we're always changing and developing. It's hard to tell because we're all parenting in the same pool. There's a deep end and there's a shallow end. For those of us who are swimming in the shallow end, we can stretch out our legs. We have a platform to stand on when we need to take a break to catch our breath. We feel more available for things like play, enjoyment, and adventure. It's not always awesome and easy, but for the most part, it's ticking along just fine. Others of us are parenting in the deep end, where we have to be on almost all the time. We're very busy putting out fires, and we feel high levels of parenting stress for long periods of time. You might wonder, why does it look so easy for everyone else? There are people at the edge of the pool for whom it can be tough to tell the shallow from the deep. There are spectators who observe who's in the pool. They might have kids playing independently in the shallow. They're lounging on beach chairs, sipping cold drinks, keeping one eye on their child, and maybe having an occasional request that they can adapt to, like, "Mom, can I have a sandwich?" "Well, not sure if I have sandwiches, but you can have a granola bar." "Aw, man, okay." And they continue to play. And then we have lifeguards. Those are monitor people in the pool. They monitor for signs that swimmers might need extra help. Parents in the shallow might be confused about why the parents in the deep end are having such a hard time having fun. Those parents seem to panic so often, find themselves drained and gasping for breath. They tread water more than they swim laps, and they usually have a child clinging to them for dear life. After a while, the parents in the deep end start to wonder if those in the shallow maybe have a point. Maybe we are making too much of this. Maybe I'm the problem. That can lead to shame, isolation, or silence. Those standing on the edge holding the life ring might have some training about how to throw the ring, but many of them aren't really sure who to throw the ring toward or when. Or if you've tread water in the deep long enough, the ring might actually be floating near you, but you A, aren't sure if it's the right ring for you, B, you're tired and you are worn, too worn to reach for it, or C, I don't want others in the pool seeing me need this ring just to stay afloat. Deep end parents who are isolated, overwhelmed, and good at pretending that it's great in the deep end are the parents who drown more quickly and the kids who start thinking that the "this is beyond normal" is about who they are, not the water that they're swimming in. Some parents are what I call synchronized swimmers. They've got that forced smile on their face. They're performing pretty well, but underneath the water, their heart is racing, their limbs are flailing, and they're trying to keep their breath. It makes it hard, actually, for lifeguards to see that you're struggling in the deep, or that you might need a real break. This can also make it more difficult to fully be noticed or understood by the lifeguards, by the swimmers in the shallow, or the spectators on the sidelines. What also makes it confusing is that kids who swim mostly in the deep occasionally spend time in the shallow. The key is to consider where they spend most of their time and their energy. So you might hear others say things like, "They seem fine when they're at school," or "When we camped together this summer with you guys, the kids seemed to get along just fine." That might just be because they only see your kid when they visit the shallow end. It also might make it more confusing for you. When you see your kid able to control their emotions or complete tasks without a whole lot of coaching, you might be baffled when the very next day they can't just seem to do those things anymore. It's a pretty defeating feeling to watch that as a parent, thinking you haven't made any gains. Asking for a life ring can require vulnerability, bravery, stamina, and an ability to weed through the available supports for the ones that fit your needs best. No small task when you're almost out of air and taking on water. I learned to swim better when others recognized I was swimming in the deep water, when the water was framed for me in context to what I was struggling with and why, and when I was told it's okay to take care of yourself. We know that naming the depth of the pool early is important for learning to swim in rough waters and strong currents that are ever-changing. It's important for your child who is struggling in those same waters and is half the size and doesn't have half the equipment to deal with the storms. When you feel like you're just hanging on, it's probably something more. And that means it's not just okay to reach for a life ring, it is encouraged. You are a good parent who is dealing with treacherous and relentless swimming conditions. There are other parents in the deep who do get it, and they are a resource. There are professionals who do understand that you are the expert on your child, and that while there are no simple fixes, you are not alone. There are a lot of situations that will land a person in the deep end of the pool. They might be your child's mental health, and it might be your own, and it's okay to be curious about both. Neither are your fault, and both are important for your wellness and your functioning as a family. It might be because of circumstances or experiences in your life that were out of your control. There are safe places to talk about the deep end, to look at it from many angles and offer it compassion and attention. Sometimes we need to problem solve. Sometimes we need to adjust our expectations and adapt our approach to parenting. And sometimes we need to grieve or heal so that we can be present and connected. The goal is always to belong to one another better and grow to our capacity, no matter where you find yourself in the pool.
So today's conversation helps us to better understand what to expect physically, emotionally, cognitively, and socially at different ages, and when something may be more. I am joined today by the lovely Karen Peters, a registered clinical counselor and mom. Karen, thanks for joining us.
It is awesome to be here.
So I'm going to let you introduce a little bit more about you so our viewers know who they're spending some time with today.
Yeah, so I am a mom of two, and I work primarily in private practice, helping navigate some hard stuff with parents and with their kids, and in the bigger context of family and all the dynamics that come with that, and our child development stuff and all those pieces. So we try and weave all of that into the work that I do. And so it's lovely to be part of these conversations, because I can't get enough about talking about mental health and how that lives itself out in the day-to-day for our kids as they grow.
Awesome. And what I really appreciate is that all the stuff we're talking about, you live every day as well. So thank you for sharing your perspective. So to better understand when our kids might be ahead or delayed in their development, it can help us to have a picture of what it's like to developmentally be on track. So can we start there?
Yeah, for sure. The first sentence that always wants to come out of my mouth is about what is normal versus not normal. And then I catch myself every time and say, everybody has their own normal. So I always work really hard to try and exchange. You might bust me during this and say, oh, she used the word, and that's fine. I'm still learning. But I always want to exchange the word normal with expected, because we're all on a continuum somewhere. And there's always on anything in the world that we measure, there's always some extreme version on either end, and then there's the bulk of where humanity sits, right? And so,
Thank goodness.
Yeah, thank goodness. So, I'm not here to tell you exactly what's normal or what's not normal. What I can tell you is a little bit about what we've learned over time to expect by observing kids of different ages, and to know what typically happens during that stage of development. So even today, as we're talking about this age range of 9 to 12, what happens typically for 9-year-olds is very different than what happens for 12-year-olds. But we can kind of look at the gamut and the overview and say, around this age, this is really kind of the overview of what we would expect it to look like. And there's a couple of reasons why that's helpful. One is to normalize our experience if we're struggling with something outside of that realm, where we think, it's not where my kid's at, and I can't put my finger on why this feels so hard, or why they're struggling so much, and why what I'm doing as a parent doesn't seem to meet them where they're at. That's hard to name sometimes without the comparison to what we should expect of the kids during that age range. So that can help us with that. But it can also help us kind of identify where to better nurture certain aspects of development, and then what we can accept is what it is, right? So so that's the reason why I think these conversations can be really helpful and kind of a guidepost for parents. So let's talk about what on track looks like. So if we're talking about where kids from 9 to 12 sit, if they are on track or what we would expect of them at this age range, let's break that down. So you beautifully kind of categorize some of those areas of development that we all walk through and we're all constantly moving through. There's physical, social, emotional, and cognitive. And I'm leaving out behavioral, because behaviors are kind of the way we live out the other 4 parts of development. So let's focus back on the core ones, and then you'll see how that kind of lives itself out in behavior. So if we start with physical development for ages 9 to 12, I probably don't have to tell you this. If you're sitting in this room or listening to this video, you probably have a kid in this age range, and the first thing that pops into your head is puberty, because that kind of defines what's physically happening for kids at this age. Their bodies are changing, hormones are shifting, moods are happening, and a lot of stuff that gets lived out in the day-to-day comes from this place of, this is the big change that happens or starts to happen in this age range. Another physical piece that happens is muscle control. Muscle control becomes much smoother, and what that means for this age group is they can push themselves, they've got stamina. So all sorts of physical activities kind of take on a new focus and meaning for kids. They get to kind of master something. This is like we're not just playing around with 10 different activities. We're like, I'm a softball player, or right. And so there's something that happens physically that allows us to really push the envelope and learn a skill really well. Socially and emotionally, I'm going to lump those two together because it's really hard to tease apart what happens inside of us emotionally and how we interact with others. So I'm going to stick those two together. Mentioned earlier, the physical component of moods start to happen as a result of the hormone changes. And moods are different than just experiencing an intense emotion to say something that happened in the classroom or with a friend or whatever. Moods are like the lens we look through when we wake up in the morning, right? So if I'm in a bad mood, I see the world through those bad mood glasses. Those moods start to happen because they're driven from a hormonal place in a kid's brain. This is not under their control. They're not saying I'm choosing to wake up in a rotten mood. It's just how they're feeling that day. And that often dictates how they perceive the world and how they interact with the world. So this is normal, and we expect this to happen. Oh, see, I said it, normal. This is what we expect to see happen. Kids in this age are also getting a little bit better at navigating things like tension or conflict. So they can suspend judgment a little longer. They can take on another person's perspective. They can stand in their shoes. They have a bit more empathy. They're starting to read social cues that maybe are a little bit more fine-tuned, where people have mixed emotions about things and we know how to have conversations around that a little better than when we're younger and we just kind of snap judgment or reaction to things, and we get into battles around that because we don't hold off and recognize there's more going on here. With this also comes a little bit better self-control. So if our kids are on track in this age range, we're watching them hold off a little bit before having maybe a big reaction to something that's automatic. They're able to think through before actually letting out what they think and feel. And with this comes a better respect for people's boundaries. So if our kids are doing well and functioning on the day-to-day, we're watching things like an interaction that happens and your kid's able to say, well, I wanted that, but I recognize that wasn't okay for my friend, and so we didn't go ahead with it. Or this was something that we had to group decide, and I was able to say, even though I didn't get my way, I recognized the benefit of everybody kind of working together to compromise. That's harder for kids who are younger, but age 9 to 12, we're starting to see that that's starting to become the norm. Another thing that happens at this age is we're not friends with everybody anymore. So beforehand, we may have been like rotating groups of friends. Like every day they came home and they said, oh, I played with so-and-so. Who's that kid? I've never heard of that kid. Now we're starting to hear about things like best friends or a close group of kids who they kind of default to connecting with. And so that's kind of an expected evolution of kind of social networking that happens when kids are in this age range. So we're starting to hear things like, I want to always do things with that one person. I want to have a sleepover with that person. I want to always default to your same crew. Socially and emotionally, there's also some tenderness to this age. Because there's a shift in wanting more pure acceptance, it comes with some vulnerability around feeling like you belong or don't belong. So there's a heightened sensitivity to feeling like I'm included or I'm excluded. And so that can have a bigger emotional impact. So earlier, like I was mentioning, we might have a whole classroom of friends we can bounce from. It doesn't feel as impactful when we're rejected by one or two people because we just bounce to the next group and then we immediately feel included. When we have our people, our one or two that we default to, and we feel like we're not included by those people, that really hits hard. So it's a different experience in this age. We're also seeing kids lean in on friendships a bit more for emotional support because kids at this age generally are better at holding space or kind of listening or identifying or having empathy. Kids start to feel safer with each other, sharing some of those vulnerabilities and saying that was really hard for me. Or I remember at that age finding girls often crying in the bathroom. Right? That was the place we went, and we hid in the bathroom because something hard happened. And then our instinct as friends was to have to go to the bathroom and check on her, right? And we'd have a conversation, and we'd dry each other's tears, and then we'd get back in to the class fold. And oftentimes those weren't things that I went home and talked to my parents about anymore. We resolved them kind of in the bathroom, right? So that starts to typically happen more. And then the last area of development we can talk about being on track with for this age is cognitive development. So kids are working better in groups. They can play games better, board games, things that require common rules, things that require maybe establishing things that are common ground before getting into the activity. They are more analytical, a little bit more logical. So they can thread things together a little bit more like, well, that makes sense. So we can agree on that. Being a bit more rational. Lots of increased language. So I think most of us think of that as happening at around like the 2 to 5 age, where we see this massive burst in language development, where all of a sudden kids go from 50 words to 3,000 words. And that is a big stage of increase, but there's another burst that happens at this age because a lot of curriculum in school revolve now around reading and comprehension. So their word bank is just flying through the roof. And so you're going to hear kids say things that maybe have a bit of different meaning to it, and they get the meaning behind that. So they're witty, or they have some sarcasm, or they're getting how to use language differently, which is kind of a fun phase.
They're starting to understand the things we're saying that they weren't before.
Well, all the adultisms that we were doing around them that just went over their head. Yeah, they're in on it now. Yeah, for sure. And being able to self-start and finish something is a big thing at this age, where we're not having to do like one step at a time, right? Or maybe even 3 steps at a time. We can say, here's a project. You break it down. And where are you going to start, and where are you going to insert the metal, and where are you going to finish? And how will you know that you're done? And who do you hand it into? And right. And so that's a school example, but that's kind of the template that starts to happen in life for kids of, we're going to the soccer game. So instead of having to say, that means you need your shoes and a water bottle and a coat and a book because you're going to be on the sidelines for a while or whatever, they start to get into this rhythm of understanding that one big overarching demand means maybe some smaller steps, and they can think that through for themselves, which is nice for us. Right?
Yeah.
If that's on track.
Now.
No, yes. Their brain's doing the work somehow for us, which is good. And they are starting. So I'm going to say some kids start this a little earlier, and we'll talk about this maybe in the know around older kids. But right in this bridging point, we're finding kids pushing authority. So that's a really broad statement, and I don't mean that just in a real authority way, but like they're questioning everything. So they're starting to wonder for themselves what they think about things, not just because they've been taught it a certain way. And this is a beautiful phase, but also can be very challenging for people who are used to saying, this is how it is for you, to their kids. And so we don't have the same level of control. We don't have the same influence necessarily, because they're starting to say, I have a mind of my own, and I have some thoughts about that, and I'm not so sure that that's true for me. So you're going to hear some of that dialogue. So I think that's like the overarching, what we can expect from 9 to 12.
I think it's great to think about that as what we can expect, because so often when our kids start pushing back, we think we're doing something wrong, or they're being defiant in a way that's not what to expect. So I appreciate you pointing out that we know our kids are doing and thriving when they're starting to do those things, as uncomfortable as it is, but it's their job to figure out who they are, because they're also gaining a sense of identity at this age. You mentioned, I am a soccer player, I am. So they're really getting in touch with who they are. And sometimes they have to push us away to figure out what that is on their own, without it being just a mirror image of ourselves. So
beautifully
I appreciate
said.
that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So with that in mind, we now know what we can expect. When is it that we need to be a little more curious and consider reaching out for other supports or other understandings in order to support our child when things are more? What is the more that we might see or hear from our kids in those areas?
Okay, so for physical development, more looks like significant adjustment issues. So things that aren't aligning with the changes. And this doesn't happen overnight. So it's normal for kids to have bumps and bruises along the way in this phase of trying to adapt to their new body, their new hormones, their new way of feeling, the importance of peers in their relationships. All of that stuff is actually a really huge growth hurdle. So we expect that to not just click overnight. But when it's more, it's when kids aren't learning or adjusting. They get stuck. So what that could look like is an unwillingness to talk about changes, like a denial. No, I don't want to talk about it. I refuse to acknowledge it. We're not going to have a discussion about that. It's too embarrassing. I feel shame about it. Or accepting the change. They just refuse to say that it's a thing. That's a concern. We can't adjust and move through those things and come out the other side if we're blocked and we're feeling stuck. So that would be one kind of signal to watch for. Also, on the other end of the continuum, it might be an obsession with the change, where it almost seems like that's all who they think they are, that everything is defined by the changes in their body, that they've lost sight that they are more than that. And so they can't draw on the balancing strengths of other areas where they're competent, they're feeling in control. And then this just feels like such massive upheaval because it isn't in their control. And they're having a hard time knowing who they are in the midst of it. That's something we need to be careful around. If we see behavioral changes around, if your child at this age is losing weight or not gaining the appropriate amount of weight. So sometimes I call kids in this age range shapeshifters. Thank you, Moana, because this is like this idea where our bodies actually redistribute weight, right? So we're starting to see our kids shape themselves differently in their bodies, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're losing or gaining weight. So just to be monitoring loosely, in general, is your child still growing? Is there still evidence of growth happening? And if there's behaviors that they're doing to suspend that, to deter from that, to suppress it, that's something we need to be paying some attention to. Those are the early signs, and this is a very vulnerable stage, and so it's important that we're attuned to that piece. Mm-hmm. The other physical thing around this is sleep. Kids start to need a whole lot of sleep. I've been reading about how developmentally it's similar to the speech and language growth, what we see in toddlers, and then we see again in tweens. Entering teen years, they need just as much sleep as they did when they were toddlers. So if you see the kid who never wants to get up out of bed in the morning, normal. If you see the kid who at 12 is like falling asleep in the middle of the day, normal. This is right. So these are things where like their body needs replenished energy to be able to navigate all the stuff that's happening inside them. So when we're talking about when it's more, we want to take a look at, are they actually getting adequate sleep? Are they resisting sleep? So just to pay attention to that as well. Mm-hmm. Emotionally and socially, so this is always the biggest category, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. When it's more, there's a few key kind of things we watch for. Emotional regulation. So first of all, are they still really easily agitated, overwhelmed, and melt down? If this is happening on the regular, there's probably something more going on for them. Mm-hmm. And the other part of it is when that happens, can they soothe themselves? Can they come back to a place of being grounded or present? Or do they require a ton of coaching and support in order to be able to bring that emotion back down to a level they feel in control of? That's one area. Another is that sense of self. And that, again, it's because there's so many body changes happening that can kind of hijack their sense of self. We need to remember that there's so much more than their physical sense of self. So how do they manage that? Are they super critical? Are they hard on themselves? Do they have low self-esteem? That's something to watch for. Are they comfortable or uncomfortable in their body? So how would you categorize that? Would you say, you know what, if I think about my kid overall, they're really struggling to feel comfortable in their skin. That's something that's more going on for them then. And another part of that is, can they identify what they think and feel? And can they articulate it? So some kids really struggle to tap into their own sense of self. They struggle to know, they're too busy reading the world and what's expected of them. And they are not very practiced at saying, oh, this is what I feel. This is what's happening for me in my body. And then if I can identify, can I also communicate that as though it has some value or worth, right? That I'm entitled to feel a certain way, and it's okay that I express that, and there's safe places for me to do that. And if kids are holding back significantly from being able to either tap into it or communicate it, it's something to be careful around. And then there's, again, the social piece, the interaction. So how are they interacting with others? Do they respect other people's boundaries for the most part? Are they able to communicate with words more than their bodies? So if kids are struggling with that, they are crossing other people's physical boundaries regularly, that's a concern, right? Because there's something blocking them from being able to say what they're thinking and feeling and assert themselves in a healthy way. And instead they're kind of demanding that physically. And that's where we see things like bullying start, this under-earth kind of sense of, I really desperately need a sense of control. And so that might be in that end of the spectrum, or it might be your child's on the receiving end of that spectrum of feeling like somebody's controlling them, and I don't have that sense of ability to stand up for myself or to navigate that and to seek safety. And kids at this age typically can read the room. And I know that's a bit of a loose read on this, but you know that feeling when you walk into a space and you can kind of feel the mood, and you can fit, right? You can adjust your sails and you can become part of the flow. Kids where there's something happening more really struggle with all the tiny things that need to be happening in their brain to be able to read the room well. And so if the output is they're not able to read the room, they really struggle, that at age 9 to 12 can really put you on the outs socially. So something to be mindful of there as well. Can they take another person's perspective? So are they able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes? And that's emotionally, but also in thought, like acknowledging that I am a different human than you are. And so we can experience the same very thing that happened in our classroom. I can have a different lived experience than you can. And I can acknowledge that both are valid. If they can't do that, that really makes social interaction difficult for kids. This appears too in conflict resolution, right? As you can imagine, if you don't have those skills, right, that makes navigating messy situations that much messier. So what do I do if somebody disagrees with me? How do I handle that? Do I just demand my way? Or do I have a way of negotiating, right? Kids at this age typically can manage things like sleepovers, pretty long play dates, hanging out with friends, groups, and not come out the worse, right, for wear. So if that's not the case, that's also kind of one of those flags of that should be a space they can manage. And if they can't, I'm gonna get curious about what's happening for them. And then cognitive. The last section again is just, actually, you know what? I'm going to go back to one more. I think this is an important part, social emotional. There's two parts of friendship that happen. You can get friends and you need to be able to keep friends. And if either of those are a significant struggle for your child at this social age, where peers matter more, that's going to be an important part of their development. And if they're struggling with that, they're going to need some extra support and coaching to learn the skills of How do I make friends well? And then once I have friends, how do I keep friends when things get a little bumpy? Right? That's an important piece.
Thank you.
So cognitively, I think most of us expect our kids to be able to kind of participate in family activities and chores, family management stuff around the house. And at 9 to 12, we'd like to kind of think that they can unload the dishwasher without us monitoring every dish that they pull out of the dishwasher. But if that's not the case, and I have some lived experience in this, right, where you're hovering and you're going, what is happening here? You've only done this 100 times. So we're still having these same conversations about the rhythms of doing a chore that I would have expected to have been fine-tuned by now, right? And so if that isn't happening for those basic things around the house, for basic things around team sports, for basic things around prep for school, that's a flag. There's something more happening there to pay attention to. Do they participate in parallel play? Or, so this is the continuum of play, right? We start our development of play in those earlier years where we're doing our own thing, but beside each other, but we're not really facing each other doing the same thing. So different things, but beside, versus we've chosen the same thing and now we're having to navigate how we're going to do that, you and me together. And if your kid's not moving into being able to be collaborative players from parallel players, there's something there that's probably going on that's more. So cooperation, we're looking for signs of cooperation and negotiation. And another area is rigid thinking. So are they just doubling down that there's a really hard line on things? It's very black and white. We're not looking at the gray. We're not asking those nuanced questions. There's just a right or wrong, right? And internal worlds for kids at age 9 to 12 that feel like that have a really hard time with the demands expected of them around, you need to be able to think through the exceptions to rules. And how are you going to know when there's an exception? What's the reasonable response here? Not just, I told you so, and it says in this book, right? And memory. That's the last one I want to mention here. Can they remember lived experiences and apply those? So if I had a consequence last week for a very similar situation, can I put that into execution today? Can I remember what that felt like? And then can I apply it today to adjust and do things differently? And when our kids are really struggling with learning from lived experiences, learning from challenges that we know they've been on repeat before, why can't they somehow get why that's not going to work again this time? That's a flag.
Thank you. As I listen to all of these, I think often when our children are going through them as parents, I'm thinking that I might have a little bit of, it might be catchy. Some of those developmental delays become now our developmental delays because we're having to work so hard when things are hard. So as parents, where would you suggest we begin? What would be a first step that we could take to kind of reach out and look at some of these lagging skills and development that might be there that we could help when it is more? Where would we start?
Yeah. So when I meet with families or when I meet with parents, I often ask them to kind of think more categorically about, can you just think just emotionally? How are they doing with regulating emotion? How are they doing with interacting with others? Do they feel explosive a lot of the time? Are they easily agitated? Are they really moody beyond what you'd expect? Let's just think one thing at a time, because I think if we try and I think that's the challenge, right? We can't always put our thumb on, is this okay? Or is this something more? And when we break it down for ourselves, sometimes it's easier to say, you know what, actually my kid's kind of ahead of the curve in this one area. And I think where the challenge is that the discrepancy between that area and the lag in another area is causing a problem for them, right? So this is a common one, is kids being super whip smart. So they catch all the info, everything in the book flies in their head and it sticks in their head, right? And they're just really intelligent. So cognitively, we feel like there's so much happening. The brain center responsible for things like social, emotional, and emotional regulation and control is a whole different center of the brain. So I always think about the way in which our brains develop. It starts at the back, at the base, and it comes up down the front. The last thing to develop for our kids is this prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for a whole cluster of fantastic skills, things like emotional control, logical thinking, planning and organization, right? So those don't happen at the same time as our sensory pieces, where we pick up cues from outside. So we have to be able to think about our kids, yes, in the bigger picture, but also go, what part of their brain might be actually really on track? And maybe that's just not collaborating with the other part of the brain that's got a bit of a lag going on. So when you ask the question, it's not an easy one to answer. Where do you begin?
No, it's not.
I think where you begin is try not to overwhelm yourself by just trying to say, is my kid on track or not? I think you have to kind of do your own little mini curiosity assessment about each category of development, and then dive deeper into the one that you feel your gut concern about. Like, I think genuinely there's something really holding my kid back in that one area. And I'm not yet sure what needs to happen around that, but I'm going to talk to the people who are safe and caring for my child and get curious about, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in the classroom in this area of development? And do you see what I see at home? And how do we work at that together, right?
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think it's a great place to begin, is to get curious and really focus in on that one thing and not try and do it all at once. As always, Karen, you have incredible insight to share with us, and it's so nice to look at the specifics around what is expected and when it's more. So I appreciate you bringing that all to the forefront for us. Thanks for swimming with us. So final thoughts as we wrap up.
Parents, be patient with yourselves. You can't not know all the things. Nobody does. So work together and reach out for each other's support. And if you're ever in doubt that you're swimming alone, you're not. We're all in the pool with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Family Smart has received funding for this project from the Provincial Health Authority and the Ministry of Children and Family Development in partnership with Here to Help. We are grateful for their support, and we're grateful for your feedback. So I hope you're able to take a moment to share with us what's meaningful for you to help guide our work. Wishing you ease as you find the connections that help make the hard just a little bit easier. Thank you for learning with us.